Welcome, dear viewers, to a story that transcends time and teaches us that true love is not born from first encounter, but is built silently like the mountains that shape the landscape with infinite patience. Today, I bring you a narrative that will transport us to the wild heart of Montana Territory in 1887, where a brave woman will defy the conventions of her time to find not just a home, but the true meaning of love and family. A story of second chances of wounded hearts that learn to heal, and of the transformative power of hope. But before beginning this emotional journey, I'd like to get to know you better. From what beautiful corner of the world are you watching us today? Let me know in the comments, and if this story touches your hearts as much as mine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like, so we can continue sharing these narratives that nourish the soul and remind us of the beauty of the human condition. Year 1887, location Willow Creek, Montana Territory. The train stopped with a metallic sigh that seemed to exhale all the uncertainty that Abigail Rose Thompson carried in her chest. The iron wheels had marked the rhythm of her doubts during the last 3 days since she had abandoned the paved streets of Boston to venture into the golden immensity of Montana Territory. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the felt hat that framed her delicate face, where hazel eyes reflected a mixture of determination and barely contained terror. At 26 years old, Abigail had made the most audacious decision of her life, responding to a mail-order marriage letter that promised a future far from the suffocating loneliness that had consumed her in the east. The mountains rose like silent giants on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks cutting the October sky with a beauty that hurt to contemplate. The air carried the aroma of infinite prairies, mixed with smoke from the chimneys of the small settlement of Willow Creek, where only 300 souls challenged the vastness of the territory. Ezra Isaiah Coleman was waiting for her on the IDTU platform just as he had promised in his letters. Tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years working the land, with brown hair prematurely peppered with gray and blue eyes that seemed to guard secrets that not even the mountains knew. His expression was as arid as the plains that stretched beyond the settlement, and when their gazes met, Abigail felt the first chill of warning. "Mrs. Thompson, I presume." His voice had the gravity of one who had forgotten how to whisper endearments. "Mr. Coleman." Abigail inclined her head, slightly conscious that the sweet words they had exchanged on paper now transformed into this encounter cold as the autumn wind. The silence stretched between them while Ezra took her luggage with mechanical movements. His hands, rough from work, briefly brushed hers, and Abigail noticed how he withdrew contact as if he had been burned. The carriage that would take them to the ranch was modest, but solid like everything in this land that demanded resistance before elegance. During the journey, words took refuge somewhere inaccessible, and only the sound of wheels on dry earth marked the rhythm of their shared destiny. The Coleman Ranch spread like a half-fulfilled promise under the infinite sky. The main house, built of wood and stone, spoke of working hands and winter nights by the fire. But when the door opened, Abigail found herself facing 5 pairs of eyes that observed her as if she were an intruder in sacred territory. Susanna, the oldest at 16 years, already showing the severe beauty of frontier women, looked at her with hostility so palpable that the air seemed to thicken. Her siblings, Caleb, Moses, Ruth, and little Daniel, took refuge behind her like chicks protected by a young eagle. "Children, this is Mrs. Thompson." Ezra's voice contained no warmth, as if he were introducing an employee rather than his future wife. The house breathed the presence of a woman who was no longer there. In every corner, Rebecca Coleman continued, living in the lace that adorned the windows, in the portraits that watched from the walls, in the phantom scent of lavender that permeated the rooms. Abigail felt like a discordant note in an already complete symphony. That first night, as she lay in the guest room, not in the matrimonial bedroom as she had expected, Abigail heard the whispers that filtered through the wooden walls. The children spoke of her as a threat, and Ezra's deep voice responded with monosyllables that reassured no one. The stars shone with unknown intensity in Montana's sky, but their light couldn't dispel the shadows that had settled in Abigail's heart. She wondered if she had made the greatest mistake of her life, if she had traded known loneliness for an even deeper solitude. The autumn wind beat against the windows like an omen, and in the distance, the lonely howl of a coyote seemed to echo her own fears. Would it be possible to build love where there was only practical necessity? Dawn came with the cruelty of reality. Abigail woke before the sun to demonstrate her worth, but when she went down to the kitchen, she found that Susanna had already prepared breakfast for the entire family. The young woman looked at her with a smile that cut sharper than any knife. "I thought ladies from the East didn't rise before noon," she said with a poisonous sweetness that made the younger siblings exchange nervous glances. Abigail felt the blow but didn't allow herself to show weakness. She had survived years of subtle disdain in Boston salons. She wouldn't be bent by a wounded teenager now. "In the East, I learned that morning work honors both the day and the eye. One who performs it," she responded with serenity while rolling up her sleeves to help with the chores. The following days were a succession of small, silent wars. Susanna had established her territory with the ferocity of one protecting something sacred, and every time Abigail tried to approach the younger children, the young woman appeared like an invisible but insurmountable barrier. Caleb, at 14, had inherited his father's reserve and observed Abigail with the same distrust with which a cowboy studies the horizon before a storm. Moses, at 12, was more direct in his rejection. He let his tasks go undone when she tried to help, as if her presence contaminated everything she touched. Only Ruth, at 9, and little Daniel showed some curiosity about the stranger who had come to alter their world. But even they withdrew when Susanna directed one of her warning looks at Abigail. Ezra remained like a distant mountain, working from before dawn until after dusk, speaking only what was strictly necessary, and treating Abigail with courtesy so cold it hurt more than open disdain. During meals, silence settled at the table like an unwelcome guest, broken only by the sounds of cutlery and some practical comment about cattle or weather. It was Martha Prudence Brooks who brought the first ray of light to those grey days. The 55-year-old woman arrived one afternoon with an apple pie and a smile that seemed genuine, though her shrewd eyes didn't miss details of the tension that permeated the Coleman house. "So you're the famous mail-order bride," said Martha, studying Abigail with the frankness of one who had seen too much world to mince words. "I've heard a lot about you in town." Abigail felt her cheeks catch fire. She could already imagine what kind of comments were circulating about her in Willow Creek. "I suppose not all of it is good," she murmured, serving tea in the porcelain cups Rebecca had chosen years ago. Martha laughed with a warmth that had been absent from the house for days. "Dear, in a town like this, any news is cause for conversation. But don't worry about poisonous tongues. Important truths always come to light sooner or later." There was something in the way Martha pronounced those last words that made Abigail look at her more carefully. What truths were waiting to be revealed? "In this house where secrets seem to breathe in the walls, Ezra is a good man," Martha continued as if reading Abigail's thoughts. "But pain has strange ways of protecting the heart. Sometimes it builds walls so high that even the one who built them forgets how to tear them down." That night, while Abigail sewed by the fireplace, one of the few activities the children tolerated, in silence she felt Ezra's eyes resting on her. When she looked up, he quickly averted his gaze to the fire, but for an instant she had seen something different in his expression, not coldness, but a vulnerability hidden behind years of armor. The autumn wind continued whispering secrets in the eaves of the house, and Abigail wondered how much time she would need to decipher the silent language of this broken family. Would there be room for her in a home where the ghosts of the past seemed to occupy every corner? The accident happened on one of those October days that promised early winter's arrival. Daniel, with the recklessness proper to his 6 years, had decided that the creek that meandered near the ranch was the perfect place to build a dam with stones and dry branches. Abigail saw him from the kitchen window, where she was helping Ruth prepare preserves for winter. The boy was playing on the bank, concentrated on his project with the seriousness that only small children can grant to their fantasies. But the creek, fed by the first autumn rains, ran faster and deeper than usual. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when fun turned to danger. A slip, a muffled cry, and Daniel disappeared beneath the surface of the cold water that carried golden leaves toward the valley. Abigail wouldn't remember later having made the decision to run. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her through the yard and to the creek bank, where the turbulent waters had swallowed the boy. Without thinking twice, she threw herself into water that received her like an embrace of broken crystals. The cold pierced her, like a lance stealing her breath and numbing her limbs. But her hands searched the current with the desperation of one fighting for something more valuable than life itself. When her fingers found Daniel's soaked shirt, she pulled him to her with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Getting out of the creek was like being reborn. Abigail dragged the boy to the bank, her own lungs burning while he coughed up water and terror in her arms. Ruth's screams had alerted the entire family, and when Ezra came running from the corrals, he found Abigail holding his youngest son, both soaked and trembling, but alive. For the first time since her arrival, Ezra's blue eyes truly looked at her, not as a stranger who had disrupted his routine, but as the woman who had risked her life for one of his children. His hands, rough but infinitely gentle, took Daniel from Abigail's arms, and for a moment their fingers touched in a connection deeper than any words. "Thank you," he murmured, and in that simple word was a universe of emotions he didn't know how to express. Susanna, who had arrived breathless behind her father, contemplated the scene with an expression Abigail couldn't decipher. The hostility was still there, but something had changed, as if a tiny crack had appeared in the wall the young woman had built around her heart. That night, while Abigail changed out of her soaked clothes in the privacy of her room, she found a blanket on the bed that hadn't been there before. It was a patchwork quilt, obviously handmade with colors that spoke of winter afternoons by the fire. There was no note, but she didn't need one. It was a silent gift from someone who had begun to see her differently. During dinner, the silence that usually reigned at the table was interrupted by Daniel's high voice as he recounted his aquatic adventure with the dramatization proper to children, converting his rescue into an epic worthy of storybook heroes. "Abigail flew like an angel and saved me from the water dragon," he declared with the solemnity of one announcing a universal truth. Caleb and Moses exchanged glances, and for the first time Abigail saw them smile in her presence. Ruth, the 9-year-old, dared to direct a shy smile at her over her bowl of stew, but it was Ezra's look that was engraved in her memory. It was no longer that of a stranger evaluating an intruder, but that of a man who was beginning to recognize in her something he hadn't expected to find. Respect, perhaps, or the first glimpse of something that could with time and patience become something deeper. The night wind no longer sounded so lonely as it filtered through the windows of the Coleman house. And when Abigail fell asleep, that night covered by the patchwork quilt someone had left for her, she dreamed not of Boston streets, but of clear water creeks and children laughing under Montana's golden sun. The church in Willow Creek was a modest white wooden construction that rose against November's grey sky like a promise of hope in arid land. Its pews, worn by decades of prayers and tears, had witnessed marriages that began with overflowing love, and also others that were born like Abigail and Ezra's from practical necessity and mutual convenience. Reverend Matthias Stone, a man with silver beard and kind eyes who had come to Montana when it was still untamed territory, awaited them at the altar with an expression that mixed solemnity with a hint of sadness. He had married Ezra to Rebecca 12 years ago in a ceremony full of whispered promises and gazes that shone with first love's light. This time, silence weighed like a damp blanket over the few present. Abigail had chosen her best dress, a navy blue silk ensemble she had brought from Boston, and that now seemed too elegant for the occasion. There was no veil, no bouquet of flowers, no music to accompany her entrance. Only her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as she advanced toward a future that promised to be more uncertain than promising. The 5 Coleman children occupied the first pew, their faces reflecting emotions as varied as their ages. Daniel, the youngest, observed the ceremony with the fascinated curiosity of one watching something he doesn't completely understand, but senses is important. Ruth kept her hands clasped in her lap, occasionally directing furtive glances at Abigail. Moses and Caleb had taken refuge in a mask of indifference that couldn't completely hide their discomfort. And Susanna? Susanna looked straight ahead, with a rigidity that spoke of internal battles no one else could fight for her. Martha Brooks was the only other person present, seated in the back pew, as a silent witness to this union that had more of a commercial contract than a celebration of love. Her shrewd eyes missed no details, and Abigail could feel her understanding gaze resting on her like an unspoken blessing. Ezra waited at the altar, dressed in his best suit, a black ensemble that highlighted the pallor of his face and the tension that hardened his features. When Abigail positioned herself beside him, he didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on some indefinite point beyond the altar, as if he feared that looking at her would make this farce more real than he was prepared to face. "Brothers and sisters," began Reverend Stone with his deep voice that had consoled so many grieving souls, "we gather before God to unite in holy matrimony, Ezra Isaiah Coleman and Abigail Rose Thompson." The ceremony's words followed with a formality that hurt in its emotional emptiness. When it came time for vows, Ezra pronounced his "I do" with the same inflection he would have used to confirm a cattle purchase. Abigail responded with a clear voice but devoid of the emotion that should accompany such promises. The moment to exchange rings arrived with palpable discomfort. Ezra slipped a simple gold band onto Abigail's finger without meeting her eyes, and when she did the same with the ring that had belonged to his father, their hands barely touched, as if contact were a painful reminder of the intimacy that didn't exist between them. "You may kiss the bride," announced Reverend Stone, and for the first time in the entire ceremony, Ezra looked directly at Abigail. The kiss was chaste, quick, devoid of any passion, but not therefore less loaded with meaning. It was the seal of an agreement, the signature of a contract that bound them legally, but left their hearts in the same lonely freedom they had been in before meeting. When they left the church, November's wind received them with icy gusts that seemed to foretell a harsher winter than usual. There was no celebration, no party. They simply returned to the ranch as they had come, as strangers, united by circumstances neither had truly chosen. That night, Abigail lay in the same guest room she had occupied since her arrival. Ezra had made no comment about the arrangement, and she hadn't dared ask when, or if ever, she would share his matrimonial bedroom. The ring on her finger weighed like a golden chain, beautiful but constrictive. She was officially Mrs. Coleman, now stepmother, to 5 children, who barely tolerated her and wife to a man who treated her with less intimacy than his horses. But as she lay in the darkness listening to the nocturnal sounds of the ranch that was now also her home, Abigail made a silent promise to herself. If love hadn't come with marriage, it would have to be built day by day, gesture by gesture, act of kindness after act of kindness. She had taken the first step. Now she had to have the patience and determination to take all that would follow. Montana's winter arrived with the ferocity of a hungry beast, covering the Coleman Ranch with a blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into a world of white silence. Storms followed one after another, confining the family to the interior of the house during days that seemed to stretch like centuries. It was during one of these endless afternoons when Abigail discovered the door that would change everything. She had been exploring the house with the meticulousness of one seeking to establish her place in a space that still didn't fully accept her. It was a larger construction than it had initially seemed, with rooms that spoke of better times and corners that guarded memories like hidden treasures. The door was at the end of the second-floor hallway, discreet but firmly locked. There was nothing particularly striking about it, except for the fact that it was the only one in the entire house that remained hermetically sealed. When Abigail turned the handle, she found resistance. When she asked Ruth about the room during one of their whispered conversations while sewing by the fire, the girl had paled and averted her gaze. "Papa says we should never go in there," Ruth murmured, her small fingers gripping the needle like a protective talisman. It's Mama Rebecca's place." That night during dinner, Abigail gathered courage to ask the question that had been burning in her chest. "Ezra, I noticed there's a room on the second floor that remains locked. I was wondering if—" The word broke in her lips when she saw the transformation that occurred in her husband's face. His features hardened until they became granite, and his blue eyes cooled until they reached the temperature of ice forming on the windows. "That room remains closed." His voice cut the air like a sharp blade. "And it will remain so. There's nothing there that concerns you." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. The children exchanged nervous glances, and Susanna directed a smile at Abigail that didn't reach her eyes, as if her question had confirmed some suspicion she had been harboring. "Of course," Abigail murmured, feeling as if she had transgressed some sacred law she didn't know. "I didn't mean to intrude," but the seed of curiosity once planted refused to die. During the following nights, while Ezra reviewed the ranch's account books and the children prepared for bed, Abigail found her steps directing toward the second floor, toward that door that guarded secrets everyone seemed to know except her. One night, armed with courage from accumulated loneliness and frustration, she dared to bring her ear to the wood. She didn't expect to hear anything. What sounds could a room closed for years emit? But what she found was something that left her cold: the aroma. Through the almost imperceptible cracks around the door frame, the phantom scent of lavender filtered, the same she had noticed permeating the entire house since her arrival. It was as if Rebecca Coleman's essence had remained trapped in that room, preserved like a sacred relic no one dared profane. "What are you doing here?" Ezra's voice behind her startled her so much that her heart seemed to stop for a moment. She turned to find him in the hallway with an expression that combined anger, pain, and something that looked dangerously like panic. I was just..." Words stumbled in her mouth, seeking an explanation that didn't sound like deliberate intrusion. "I said that room doesn't concern you." He approached until he was so close that Abigail could see the lines of suffering that time had carved around his eyes. "Rebecca died 3 years ago, but that room is the only thing left of her as she was, and it will remain so." The intensity of his voice, the barely contained pain that vibrated in each word, made Abigail understand that she wasn't facing just a man protecting his privacy. She was before a soul clinging to the last vestiges of a love that death had cut in full bloom. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant much more than an apology for her curiosity. "I didn't mean to. Just stay away from that door." His voice had broken slightly, revealing the vulnerability hidden behind the hardness. "Please." That night, Abigail lay awake in her bed, conscious that she had stumbled upon the very heart of the mystery surrounding her marriage. It wasn't just that Ezra didn't love her, it was that he still deeply loved another woman. And that woman, though dead, continued to be more real in this house than the living wife who slept alone in the guest room. The night wind moaned around the house like a lament, and Abigail wondered if she could ever compete with a ghost who lived preserved behind a locked door. Silas Cornelius Blake arrived in Willow Creek with the first serious snowfall of winter, wrapped in a fur coat that proclaimed his prosperity, and riding a black horse that seemed as arrogant as its owner. He was a 45-year-old man who had made his fortune buying lands from desperate families and reselling them to Eastern speculators, a merchant who saw opportunities where others saw tragedies. His interest in the Coleman Ranch wasn't new, but Abigail's arrival had provided an angle of attack he hadn't had before. An Eastern wife married by correspondence with no roots in the community. The possibilities for manipulation were endless for a man of his cunning. The first time Abigail saw him was at Willow Creek's general store, where she had gone to buy provisions for the long-approaching winter. She was selecting wool to knit socks when she felt eyes watching her with an intensity that made her look up. Silas Blake had the kind of attractiveness that came with power and money: perfectly groomed blonde hair, carefully trimmed mustache, and green eyes that shone with an intelligence that knew exactly how to use itself. His smile was charming, the type that made women feel special and men lower their guard. "You must be the new Mrs. Coleman," he said, approaching with the confidence of one accustomed to being well received. "Silas Blake at your service. I've heard much about you, madam." Abigail accepted his gloved hand with courtesy, but something in his smile immediately put her on guard. It was too perfect, too practiced. "Mr. Blake, it's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is entirely mine, I assure you." His eyes assessed her in a way that felt more like merchandise than person. "I must say Ezra is a fortunate man, though I fear ranch life must be quite an adjustment for a lady accustomed to Eastern comforts." There was something in the way he pronounced adjustment that suggested he had investigated her more than was appropriate for a simple, casual encounter. "I adapt well, thank you," she responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Montana has its own charms. Blake laughed with laughter that sounded genuine, but couldn't warm the coldness radiating from his eyes. Of course. Though I must admit I worry about the families in the region. The last winters have been hard and the cattle, well, Ezra and I have had some conversations about the financial difficulties he faces. Abigail frowned. In the week she had been at the ranch, she hadn't seen signs of serious economic problems. True money wasn't abundant, but there were no signs of the desperation Blake seemed to insinuate. I'm not aware of any financial difficulties, Mr. Blake. Oh, of course not. Ezra is a proud man, not the type to share his concerns with someone who has just come to be part of the family. His smile became condescending. But when times get harder, and they will get harder, believe me, I hope you'll consider me a friend willing to help. That night Abigail mentioned the encounter during dinner. Ezra's reaction was immediate and visceral. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth and a look of disgust crossed his face. Silas Blake. What did that vulture want? Just to introduce himself. He mentioned something about financial difficulties. That man is a jackal who feeds on others' misfortune. Ezra's voice had a dangerous edge. He's been trying to buy my land for 2 years, inventing problems that don't exist, and offering help nobody needs. Susanna looked up from her plate, and for the first time since Abigail's arrival, her eyes showed no hostility but something like approval. Papa's right. Mr. Blake told the Martinez girls it wasn't appropriate for an Eastern woman to raise frontier children. He said you probably didn't even know how to milk a cow. The statement fell on the table like a stone in a lake, creating waves of tension that reached everyone present. Abigail felt humiliation color her cheeks, but she also felt something more, a spark of anger, that surprised her with its intensity. Well, she said with a soft voice, but loaded with determination, I suppose I'll have to prove Mr. Blake wrong about many things. That night, while the wind howled around the house like a warning, Abigail had the disturbing feeling that Blake had thrown the first stone of an avalanche that could bury everything she had begun to build in Montana. But she also knew she wouldn't be a passive victim of his manipulations. The silent war had begun, and Abigail Coleman, because that was her name now, whether certain people liked it or not, was prepared to fight. The storm came with the fury of ancient Indian legends, transforming the world into a whirlwind of wind and snow that erased the line between sky and earth. It had begun as a gentle snowfall during the early morning, but by noon it had become a blizzard that howled like a wounded beast around the Coleman house. Moses had gone out early to check the fences in the North Corral, a routine task that had become urgent when some of the horses had shown signs of nervousness during the previous night. At 12 years old, he was responsible enough to handle simple tasks but not experienced enough to recognize the signs that announced the type of storm that could kill. When the wind began to roar with true ferocity, Ezra went out to look for him, but visibility had been reduced to just a few meters. He returned an hour later, soaked and trembling with empty hands, and an expression of panic Abigail had never seen before. I can't find him, he gasped, shaking snow from his coat. The tracks disappeared with the wind. Susanna paled until she was the color of snow beating against the windows. Caleb headed for the door, but Ezra stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. No, I won't lose another son in this storm. The search was organized with the precision of desperation. Ezra and Caleb would take the north direction toward the corrals. Susanna would remain in the house with Ruth and Daniel, keeping lamps lit in the windows as beacons to guide the return home. And Abigail. You stay here, Ezra ordered, but in his voice there was more plea than authority. I can't risk. I know these fields as well as any of you now, Abigail interrupted, reaching for her heaviest coat. And Moses trusts me. If he's hurt and scared, he might hide from you, but not from me. It was true. In the month since the creek incident, she had developed a special relationship with the quiet boy with sad eyes. Moses had begun seeking her company during ranch tasks, sharing with her the small worries he didn't dare confide to his father, overburdened with responsibilities. The storm received her like an icy fist that hit her with enough force to make her stagger. The wind stole words from her mouth before she could pronounce them, and snow blinded her eyes until it converted the world into a disorienting white whirlwind. But Abigail had learned to read the ranch's language during these months. She knew the natural shelter formed by rocks near the creek, the place where Moses used to go when he needed to be alone. If he was lost and seeking protection, that would be his instinct. She found him curled against the base of the rocks, soaked, and trembling with one leg bent at an angle that made Abigail's stomach contract with terror. But he was conscious, and when he saw her face, his eyes filled with tears that froze almost instantly on his cheeks. "I knew you would come," he murmured with a hoarse voice. "I knew you wouldn't leave me here." Getting Moses out of the rocks and back to the house was the hardest task Abigail had faced in her life. The boy couldn't walk, and his weight, though light, felt like lead when each step had to be a battle against wind that threatened to knock them both down. When they finally reached the house with Abigail, more carrying than helping a Moses who was delirious from cold, they found Ezra and Caleb, who had just returned from their fruitless search. The expression of relief that crossed Ezra's face when he saw his son was something Abigail would keep forever. But the real test came later, during the long nights that followed, while Moses fought against the fever that had come with the broken leg. Abigail didn't leave his side applying cold compresses when the temperature rose too high, forcing him to drink broth when he refused to eat, telling him stories of Boston when nightmares kept him awake. It was during one of these endless nights when Ezra finally spoke the words he had been keeping since the rescue. "You could have died out there. You could have died looking for my son." Abigail looked up from Moses's feverish face, finding Ezra's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. "He's my son too now," she replied simply. "All of them are." Something changed in Ezra's expression at that moment. A wall that had been standing for years began to show the first cracks, and for an instant, Abigail glimpsed the man he had been before pain built fortresses around his heart. Moses recovered slowly but completely, and when he could finally walk again, he did so with a slight limp that would serve as a permanent reminder of the night an Eastern woman had risked her life to bring him home. More importantly, it was the night Ezra Coleman began to see his wife, not as a practical necessity, but as something much more dangerous and promising, as someone he could come to love. The confrontation came on a March afternoon when spring thaw had converted the ranch into a sea of mud, and tension, accumulated during the long winter months, finally found its breaking point. It had started as an argument about something as simple as dinner. Abigail had prepared a stew with spices she had brought from Boston, an attempt to add variety to the ranch's monotonous diet. But when Susanna tasted the first spoonful, her expression contorted into an exaggerated grimace of disgust. "This doesn't taste like anything Mama would have cooked," she declared, dropping her fork with a dramatic blow that echoed in the kitchens. Silence. Mama knew how to cook real food, not these strange experiments. It had been the drop that overflowed the glass. Months of biting comments, constant comparisons with Rebecca's sainted memory, passive but relentless resistance that had eroded Abigail's patience like water erodes stone. "Enough!" The word came out with more force than Abigail had intended, making everyone at the table freeze. "Enough, Susanna." The 16-year-old looked at her with surprise that quickly transformed into open defiance. "Enough of what of telling? The truth of remembering the woman who was really my mother. Enough of using your mother's memory as a weapon against me." Abigail stood from the table, her hands trembling slightly but her voice firm. "Enough of acting as if my presence here were an insult to her legacy." The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Ruth and Daniel exchanged nervous glances while Caleb and Moses shrank in their chairs as if they wanted to disappear. But Ezra simply watched with an inscrutable expression. "And what do you suggest?" Susanna's voice dripped adolescent venom. "That I pretend I'm happy Papa married a stranger 6 months after meeting her, that I act as if you were our mother when our real mother has been dead barely 3 years. I don't intend to replace your mother." Abigail's words emerged from a deep and painful place she didn't know existed. "I never could or would want to do so, but I'm here, Susanna. I'm here every day caring for you and your siblings, trying to build something good in this family. And you—" Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "You've made me feel like an intruder in my own home since the first day. As if I had no right to be here, as if I didn't deserve even the most basic courtesy." Susanna jumped up from her chair, her face reddened with anger. "Because you shouldn't be here. Papa married you because he needed someone to take care of us, not because he loved you. Everyone knows, even you know." The silence that followed these words was like a vacuum that swallowed all oxygen from the room. Abigail felt as if she had received a slap, not because the words were cruel, but because they were true. It was then that Ezra finally spoke, and his voice had a dangerous edge that made everyone turn toward him. "Enough!" He stood slowly, his imposing height casting a shadow over the table. "Susanna, go to your room. Now." "But Papa." "Now." The young woman left the kitchen like a storm, her footsteps echoing on the stairs until her bedroom door shook the entire house. Ezra turned to Abigail, and for a moment she thought he would also attack her, that he would confirm his daughter's cruel words. But when he spoke, his voice was strangely soft. "Children, go finish your chores. Your stepmother and I need to talk." When they were alone, silence stretched between them like an abyss. Abigail remained standing by the table, her hands resting on the back of her chair, waiting for the final blow. "Is that what you think?" Ezra asked finally. "That I see you only as come as an employee with a wedding ring?" Abigail looked up to meet his eyes, and what she saw there surprised her. It wasn't anger nor confirmation of Susanna's accusations. It was something that looked dangerously like vulnerability. "Isn't it true?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "We married for convenience, Ezra. You needed a mother for your children, I needed a home. In 6 months you've barely—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but both knew what she referred to. The lonely nights, conversations that didn't deepen beyond the practical, the emotional distance he maintained like armor. Ezra approached until he stood before her so close that Abigail could see the small lines around his eyes, the marks that pain and responsibility had carved in his face. "You're right," he admitted, and the words seemed torn from the deepest part of his being. "At first, that's all I expected. A practical solution to a practical problem." Abigail felt something break inside her chest. "But," he continued, and his voice had become hoarse, "but that was before seeing you risk your life for Daniel, before seeing you care for Moses as if he were your own son, before seeing you face each day with a strength I didn't know existed." His hands rose as if to touch her face, but stopped in the air, trembling slightly. "Susanna is wrong. At first she was right, but now she's wrong, and I've been a coward for not telling you before." The world seemed to stop at that moment, suspended in the possibility of words that could change everything. But before either could speak, screams from upstairs broke the spell. It was Susanna, and she was screaming her father's name with a terror that froze both adults' blood. The fire had started in Susanna's room, apparently from a candle she had left too close to the curtains while crying after the confrontation at dinner. When Abigail and Ezra arrived running to the second floor, they found the young woman terrified in the hallway, watching flames devour her room with a voraciousness that threatened to spread to the rest of the house. There was no time for discussions or recriminations. Ezra organized a human chain with the children passing buckets of water from the yard pump to the second floor, while Abigail threw herself into the burning room to rescue what she could of Susanna's belongings. The fire was controlled before it spread, but the damage was done. Susanna's room was a black and smoking shell, and with it had been lost years of memories, the diary, where she wrote her most intimate thoughts, the dress that had been Rebecca's, and that she hoped to wear at her own wedding, the letters her mother had written to her before dying. When everything was over, when the last smoke had vanished into the starry March night, Susanna collapsed in the wet yard and cried as she hadn't cried since her mother's funeral. But she wasn't alone. Abigail sat beside her on the muddy ground, not caring that her dress was stained with ash and mud, and simply held her while the young woman emptied herself with sobs that seemed to tear pieces from her soul. "Everything burned," Susanna moaned against Abigail's shoulder. "Everything I had left of her." "Not everything," Abigail murmured, stroking the golden hair of the young woman. "Her love for you will never burn. That will live as long as you live. It was at that moment, sitting in the mud, while the family watched them from a respectful distance, when something fundamental changed between them. Susanna raised her tear and soot-stained face, and for the first time since Abigail's arrival, she looked at her without hostility. "I'm sorry for everything I said at dinner," she whispered. "I'm sorry for being so cruel to you. You didn't deserve that." "You were protecting your mother's memory," Abigail replied gently. "That speaks well of your heart, not ill. But you were right. I've been unfair. You've been good to us, even when I was horrible to you." Susanna wiped tears, with the back of her hand leaving clean trails on her dirty cheeks. "Mama used to say that love doesn't subtract when it adds, that loving new people doesn't mean loving less those who are already in your heart." The words floated in the night air like a blessing, and Abigail felt something that had been tense in her chest finally relax. The days following the fire were of reconstruction, both literal and emotional. While Ezra and the boys worked on repairing the damaged room, Abigail and Susanna embarked on the project of creating a new space that honored the past, but also embraced the future. It was Susanna who suggested they look in the attic for things that had belonged to Rebecca, treasures stored that could decorate the new room, and it was during this search when they made a discovery that would change everything they believed they knew about the past. Among the dusty boxes in the attic, wrapped in a wool blanket and hidden like a shameful secret, they found a diary. But it wasn't Rebecca's diary, it was Ezra's, written during the last months of his first wife's life. Susanna opened it with trembling hands, and the first lines she read aloud filled the attic with a silence deeper than death. "Rebecca is getting sicker, but she refuses to admit it. Last night she coughed blood again, and when I tried to convince her to see the doctor, she got so furious she left the house in the middle of a storm. She didn't return until dawn, soaked and trembling. I fear my insistence is making things worse between us." Abigail felt as if the floor had opened beneath her feet. Susanna paled until she was the color of the yellowed paper in her hands. "They found her this morning by the creek. The doctor says it was pneumonia, but I know the truth. She died because she left the house angry with me because I couldn't make her listen to me. If I hadn't insisted so much, if I had been more patient, Rebecca would still be alive." The truth revealed itself like a wound that had been bleeding in secret for years. Rebecca hadn't died in an inexplicable accident. She had died because Ezra had tried to help her, and she, in her stubbornness and fear, had rejected that help. And Ezra had been carrying the guilt since then, convinced that his love had been the cause of her death. "That's why he kept her room locked," Susanna whispered, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "That's why he couldn't bear to talk about her. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt." Abigail gently closed the diary, feeling the weight of secrets it had contained for so long. "Your father has been punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault," she murmured, "and we, all of us, have been living with a ghost he created to protect himself from pain." That night, Susanna did something that would have been unthinkable weeks before she took Abigail's hand and led her to her father's room. "Papa," she said with a voice that had matured years in a matter of days, "we need to talk. The three of us, about Mama, about Abigail, and about the truth you've been hiding too long." And for the first time in 3 years, Ezra Coleman prepared to face the past he had been fleeing. The locked room opened for the first time in 3 years with the sound of a key turning in a lock rusted by unshed tears. Ezra trembled as his fingers touched the bronze handle, and when the door finally opened, the past came out to meet like an overflowing river. Rebecca's room had been preserved like a sanctuary. Her Sunday dress still hung in the closet, her books remained stacked on the nightstand exactly as she had left them, and on the dresser, her silver brush still held some golden hairs tangled in the bristles. The scent of lavender that had permeated the entire house emanated from this space, like the perfumed heart of a memory that refused to die. Abigail and Susanna flanked Ezra as he ventured into the room with hesitant steps, like a man walking on ice that could break at any moment. His eyes traveled over each object with a mixture of pain and reverence that was painful to witness. "I thought if I kept everything the same, if I didn't change anything, she wouldn't have really left," he murmured with a hoarse voice, heading to the window where Rebecca used to sit to sew. I thought she deserved this preserved place because it had been my fault she died. Susanna approached and took her father's hand with a tenderness that spoke of the woman she was becoming. Papa, we read your diary. We know what really happened. Ezra turned to them with eyes that looked like those of a man who had just received a death sentence. Then you know I'm right. If I hadn't insisted so much that she see the doctor, if I had been more patient with her stubbornness, Rebecca wouldn't have gone out that night. She wouldn't have died of pneumonia. Oh, Ezra. Abigail's voice was soft as a caress. Do you really believe Rebecca would have wanted you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for trying to save her? I killed her with my insistence. No. The word came out with a firmness that surprised even Abigail. You loved her enough to fight for her life even when she didn't want to fight for herself. That's not guilt, Ezra. That's love. Susanna went to the dresser and picked up her mother's silver brush, observing the golden hairs that still clung to it like ghosts. Mama was stubborn, Papa. We both know that. When she got something in her head, nothing and no one could make her change her mind. Remember when she insisted on taming that wild horse despite you saying it was dangerous? A ghostly smile touched Ezra's lips. She spent 3 days with bruises before admitting I was right. Exactly. And that same stubbornness was what made her reject the doctor's help until it was too late. But that wasn't your fault, Papa. It was just who she was. Abigail approached until she stood before Ezra, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of all the truths she had been keeping. You spent 3 years building a prison around your heart, using guilt as bars and Rebecca's memory as a lock. But the prisons we build ourselves are the only ones we can choose to leave. The tears Ezra had been holding for years finally found their way rolling down his cheeks like rivers of liberation. I don't know how to let her go, he confessed. I don't know how to love again without feeling like I'm betraying her. It was Susanna who answered with a wisdom that made her seem much older than her 16 years. Mama told me once that the human heart has no capacity limits, that we can continue loving people who are gone while making room to love those who arrive. Loving Abigail doesn't mean loving Mama less Papa. It means you learn to make your heart big enough for both. The silence that followed was charged with possibilities. Ezra looked around the room that had been his altar of guilt, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a sanctuary he had to preserve, but memories he could keep, without allowing them to imprison him. Rebecca is in my heart, he said finally with a firm voice. She'll always be there. But you... He turned to Abigail with eyes that finally saw clearly. You're here, real alive, loving my children as if they were yours. And I've been a fool for not realizing that love isn't a treasure that's depleted when shared. He approached Abigail until he could take her hands in his rough from work, but infinitely gentle. Abigail Rose Coleman. I've wasted too much time. I've been a terrible husband and a worse man. But if you can give me the chance, if you can forgive a fool who didn't know how to recognize the gift he had before him, I'd like to start over. With you, truly with you. When Abigail answered, her voice trembled with contained emotion. Ezra, I don't need you to start over. I just need you to start now. And when they kissed for the second time, the first had been the seal of a contract, this was the promise of true love. Susanna smiled through her tears and knew that her family for the first time in 3 years was complete again. Rebecca's room would remain as a place of cherished memories, but no longer as a prison of guilt. And that night, for the first time since their marriage, Abigail slept in the matrimonial bedroom, in the arms of a man who had finally learned that loving again wasn't betrayal, but the most beautiful way to honor the love he had known before. The spring of 1888 came to the Coleman Ranch like a resurrection. The fields dressed in tender green, the creeks sang with meltwater, and the house that had been immersed in years of silent mourning awakened to the sound of laughter and voices that rose without fear of judgment from already forgiven ghosts. Abigail flourished like a plant that finally receives sun after a long winter. Her face, which had carried the tension of months of uncertainty, relaxed into lines of genuine contentment. Her eyes shone with a light that came not just from personal happiness, but from the deep knowledge of having found her place in the world. Ezra transformed into the man his children had hoped to recover since their mother's death. The rigidity that had characterized his movements softened into more spontaneous gestures. His laughter, which had been buried under layers of guilt and pain, resurfaced like a spring that bubbles after a drought. And his eyes, when they looked at Abigail, shone with a love that was new, but also deeply rooted. The children responded to this change like flowers responding to sun. Daniel, the youngest, stopped constantly seeking adult approval and recovered the natural confidence of childhood. Ruth became more talkative, sharing with Abigail her dreams of becoming a teacher and her theories about why stars shone brighter in Montana than anywhere else in the world. Moses, who had developed a special connection with Abigail since his rescue during the storm, became her voluntary shadow, following her in daily tasks and absorbing the life lessons she shared while they worked together. Caleb, cautious by nature but observant, began to relax his guard and allow Abigail to guide him in the finer aspects of ranch management. But it was the change in Susanna that most moved Abigail. The young woman who had been her fiercest antagonist became something like a daughter and a friend. Susanna had inherited her father's sharp intelligence and her mother's determination, but now channeled those qualities toward dreams that transcended traditional expectations for frontier women. "I want to teach," she confided to Abigail one afternoon while helping her hang laundry in the sun. "Not just the children in town, but adults who never learned to read. I want women to know they can be more than just wives and mothers, though being a wife and mother is also beautiful when freely chosen." Abigail smiled as she hung one of Ezra's shirts, noticing how the wind played with the fabric and made it dance like a victory flag. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you're becoming." "I think you are too," Susanna replied, and in those words was a recognition worth more than any formal declaration of affection. The ranch prospered under the new family harmony. Ezra, freed from the weight of guilt that had been crushing his entrepreneurial spirit, implemented improvements he had been postponing for years. The corrals were expanded, a new well was dug to ensure water during dry summers, and fruit trees were planted that in a few years would provide shade and food. Abigail contributed her own touch, establishing a medicinal herb garden that soon became a valuable resource for the entire community. Her knowledge of healing plants acquired in Boston, but adapted to Montana conditions, made her a respected figure among the town's women who had initially received her with suspicion. But it was the transformation of their marriage that provided the solid foundation on which everything else flourished. Ezra and Abigail discovered that their love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared adversities, had a solidity that loves born from instant passion rarely achieved. Their nighttime conversations by the fire became intimate and deep, exploring not just the day's events, but dreams for the future and lessons from the past. Ezra shared stories of the ranch's early days when each winter was a struggle for survival, and Abigail spoke of her life in Boston, of books she had read and ideas she had harbored about the world beyond tea salons. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her one night while she brushed her hair before bed. "Leaving civilization for this wild place?" Ezra, who was watching her from the bed with an expression of barely contained adoration, smiled with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Civilization isn't in paved streets or elegant buildings, Abigail. It's in the way you treat a hurt child, in the patience with which you teach a rebellious young woman, in the courage with which you build a home where there was only a house." He stood and approached until he was behind her, taking the brush from her hands to continue the task, with gentle movements that were more caress than function. "You're the most civilized woman I've ever known, and also the wildest. Wild in your courage, in your capacity to love without limits, in your refusal to surrender when everything seemed lost." When they lay down that night, intertwined in an intimacy that was both emotional and physical, Abigail knew she had found something she didn't know she was looking for. Not just a home, but a place where her soul could be completely itself. The farce. Summer of 1888 would be remembered at the Coleman Ranch as the season when true love took deep roots in soil that had been fertilized by suffering but watered by hope. And while Montana's stars shone over the family that slept in peace under their roof, the future stretched before them like an infinite prairie full of possibilities. Silas Blake had watched from the shadows the Coleman family's flourishing with the venomous patience of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For months he had sown rumors and doubts in town, painting Abigail as a corrupting influence that would turn children away from their Western roots, and Ezra from the sensibility that had characterized his business decisions. His opportunity came when Daniel, the youngest of the Colemans, suffered an apparently minor fall while playing near the stables. What began as a simple bruise became infected with alarming speed, and the fever that followed put the boy on death's threshold for days that felt like years to the entire family. Abigail didn't leave Daniel's side, applying the nursing techniques she had learned caring for Moses during his recovery. But when the medicinal herbs from her garden couldn't break the fever, and the nearest doctor was 3 days' journey away due to torrential rains that had converted roads into rivers of mud, desperation settled in the Coleman house like an unwelcome guest. It was during this crisis when Blake made his boldest and most ruthless move. He presented before the district judge a formal petition alleging child neglect, supported by documents that seemed to demonstrate the Coleman family had accumulated dangerous debts that made them unfit guardians for the children. The documents were masterful forgeries, but in a territory where official records were scarce and oral testimony had legal weight, Blake's accusations found fertile ground, especially when he accompanied them with insinuations about the foreign influence of an Eastern woman who had seduced a vulnerable widower and now endangered his children's welfare with unorthodox healing methods. The legal notification arrived at the cruelest possible moment when Daniel was fighting death and the entire family was emotionally devastated. Ezra read the documents with a fury that made the veins in his neck stand out like taut cords. "That damned vulture has been waiting for us to be most vulnerable," he growled, crumpling the papers in his fists. "He knows we can't leave Daniel to go defend ourselves in town." It was Martha Brooks who saved the situation. The 55-year-old woman had been watching Blake's maneuvers with the patience of one who had seen enough power struggles to recognize the patterns. When she learned of the impending trial, she appeared at the Coleman ranch with a determination reminiscent of ancient legend warriors. "I'll stay with Daniel," she announced, setting her medicine bag on the kitchen table. "You go to that trial and destroy that snake once and for all." The trial was held in Willow Creek's community hall, a room normally used for dances and festive gatherings, but now transformed into a legal battlefield. Blake had managed to gather a group of witnesses who seemed impressive on paper merchants, who swore they had heard rumors about Coleman's debts, women who expressed concern about Abigail's unconventional educational methods, men who questioned the wisdom of allowing a stranger to influence Western children's upbringing. But Blake had underestimated two crucial factors: the loyalty Abigail had earned during months of selfless service to the community and the protective ferocity of the Coleman children themselves. Martha Brooks rose as a witness for the defense, with a dignity that would silence the most eloquent lawyers. With clear and firm voice, she methodically exposed each of Blake's falsifications, revealing contradictions in dates and signatures that made evident the fraudulent nature of the documents. "Silas Blake," she declared, looking directly at the man who had orchestrated the entire farce, "has been trying to buy Coleman land for 2 years. When Ezra repeatedly refused to sell, he decided to use the law as a weapon to take by force what he couldn't obtain through legitimate means." But it was the children's testimony that truly changed the trial's course. Susanna rose with the composure of an adult woman and the passion of a young woman fighting for her family. Her voice didn't tremble when she described the care Abigail had lavished on each of them, from Daniel's rescue at the creek to the vigil nights caring for Moses during his illness. "Abigail Coleman is our mother," she declared with a clarity that echoed in every corner of the hall. "Not because she gave birth to our bodies, but because she nurtured our souls. Any man who tries to separate us from her will have to face all of us." Caleb, Moses, Ruth, and even little Daniel, who had insisted on attending despite his recent weakness, took the stand one after another to confirm their older sister's words. Their testimonies were simple but devastating, painting a picture of a united family that no amount of falsified documents could contradict. When the judge finally dictated his verdict, The words echoed like victory bells. The charges against the Coleman family are dismissed for lack of substantial evidence. Furthermore, this court recommends that Mr. Blake be investigated for possible document falsification. Blake left the trial as a defeated man, his reputation in ruins and his territorial expansion plans destroyed. A few months later, he would leave Montana forever, leaving behind only the memory of his failed greed. That night, while the Coleman family celebrated their victory around the hearth, Abigail understood she had won something more valuable than any legal battle. She had gained confirmation that true love, once established, was a fortress no external enemy could conquer. The family that had begun as a commercial agreement had transformed into something sacred, united not just by blood, but by the conscious choice to stay together against all odds. The autumn of 1888 painted Montana Territory with colors that seemed extracted from an artist's dreams, golds that rivaled the sun reds that competed with fire, and oranges that made the very air seem incandescent. It was harvest time, both literal and metaphorical, and the Coleman Ranch had prospered beyond Ezra's most optimistic hopes. The wheat fields undulated like a golden sea under autumn wind, promising a harvest that would not only ensure winter survival, but provide surpluses to trade in Billings. The corrals were full of healthy cattle, and the new well had proven its worth during the dry summer that had devastated many neighboring ranches. But the true harvest was measured in the changes that had flourished in each family member. Susanna had turned 17 with a maturity that had made her the most sought-after young woman in Willow Creek. 3 suitors had already called at the ranch door, but she had received them with courtesy and dismissed them with firmness. Her plans transcended early marriage. She had begun teaching reading to the town's younger children, and her dream of establishing a formal school was approaching reality each day. "I'm in no hurry to marry," she confided to Abigail one afternoon while they prepared preserves for winter. "I want to be like you choose my destiny, because it's what my heart wants, not because it's what's expected of me." Caleb, now 15, had assumed responsibilities that made him his father's indispensable right hand. His love for the land had flourished into practical knowledge that promised to make the Coleman Ranch one of the region's most prosperous. But he had also developed a sensitivity that led him to compose small poems about mountains and sunsets, verses he shared only with Abigail in moments of special confidence. Moses, at 13, had completely overcome the after-effects of his accident. His barely perceptible limp reminded him constantly of the day Abigail had risked her life for him, and that gratitude had transformed into a devotion that made him her fiercest defender. He was the one who took charge of the medicinal herb garden, developing plant knowledge that rivaled many doctors. Ruth, at 10, had inherited her family's intellectual curiosity, but channeled it toward the stars. She spent clear nights in the yard with a telescope Ezra had given her for her birthday, mapping constellations and dreaming of worlds beyond Montana. Her astronomy questions had led Abigail to write letters to her Boston contacts, requesting books and star maps to feed the girl's passion. And Daniel, now 7, had grown without remembering even a time when Abigail hadn't been part of his world. For him, she wasn't stepmother, but simply mother, the woman who had been present at every important moment of his conscious childhood. But it was a late October discovery that completed the Coleman family's transformation in a way no one had anticipated. Abigail had been feeling unusual fatigue during recent weeks, accompanied by a sensitivity to smells she initially attributed to harvest stress. But when morning nausea became regular, the truth revealed itself with a clarity that left her breathless. She was expecting a child. The news filled her first with terror, then with a joy so intense it seemed too big for her body. At 27, she had begun to accept the possibility that she would never experience biological motherhood. The 5 Coleman children had filled that void in ways she hadn't expected, but the prospect of carrying Ezra's child within her awakened emotions she didn't know she possessed. When she finally gathered courage to tell Ezra, she found him in the stable brushing horses, with the rhythmic movements that calmed him after difficult days. Sunset light filtered through wooden boards, creating golden bands that fell across his hair and broad shoulders. "Ezra," she murmured, and something in her voice made him turn immediately, the brush forgotten in his hand. "I need to tell you something." The expression of concern that crossed his face slowly transformed into amazement, as Abigail, with words that stumbled between emotion and nervousness, revealed the secret she had been keeping. For a moment that seemed to last eternities. Ezra remained motionless, processing the information. Then, with a movement that was more leap than step, he took her in his arms and spun her in the air with a joy that made the horses whinny in surprise. "A baby?" he asked, as if the words were a foreign language he was learning. "Our baby." "Our baby," Abigail confirmed, and when he kissed her, she could taste the tears of happiness rolling down both their cheeks. That night, when the news was shared with the children during dinner, the reaction was a symphony of joy that would have made angels blush. Susanna screamed with enthusiasm that made plates tremble. Caleb smiled with a tenderness that made him seem much older than his 15 years. Moses solemnly declared he would be the best big brother a baby could want. Ruth immediately began planning stories she would tell it, and Daniel announced he would share his most precious toys. While the family celebrated around the table with voices rising in simultaneous conversations about names and preparations, and the future opening before them like a book of golden pages, Abigail felt her heart might explode with pure happiness. She had come to Montana seeking security and had found love. She had expected survival and had discovered prosperity. She had feared rejection and had reaped acceptance so complete it sometimes overwhelmed her with its intensity. And now, with a new life growing within her, and 6 hearts that loved her without reservation, Abigail Coleman knew she had found not just a home, but the place where her soul belonged for all eternity. The autumn wind whispered promises through. Open windows and Montana's stars shone like witnesses to a love that had flourished against all odds, creating roots so deep that no storm could ever uproot them. Epilogue, 10 years later. Spring 1897. The Coleman Ranch stretched under 1897's spring sun like a living testament to love and perseverance's transformative power. The fruit trees Ezra and Abigail had planted during their marriage's early years now provided generous shade and flowers that perfumed the air with abundance's promises. The original house had grown with the family, adding rooms that welcomed not just permanent residents, but frequent visitors, married children returning with their own families, friends from the school Susanna had managed to establish, and travelers who knew the Coleman Ranch was a refuge where hospitality was as abundant as harvests. Abigail, now 37, rocked gently on the front porch, her hands busy with knitting while observing evening activity. Her brown hair showed the first silver threads and her face carried lines that come from years of smiling under Montana sun. Beside her, in a cradle carved by Caleb's skilled hands, Faith slept her 5-year-old daughter with pink cheeks and golden hair that reminded of Rebecca, but was uniquely hers. Grace, 8 years old, ran through the yard with childhood's tireless energy, chasing chickens with a determination that would have been comical if not for her serious purpose of helping with ranch chores. Her joyful shouts mixed with evening's familiar sounds, cattle lowing returning from pastures, metallic sound of tools being stored in the barn, men's voices finishing the day's labors. Susanna had fulfilled her dream of becoming a teacher, but had gone beyond the most ambitious expectations. Her school not only served Willow Creek's children, but had established an adult program that had transformed the community. At 27, she had finally accepted Thomas Mitchell's marriage proposal. The town's new doctor, a man whose intelligence matched hers and whose respect for her professional ambitions had been the deciding factor in her acceptance. The wedding had been celebrated in spring in the ranch garden, under an arch of flowers the entire family had helped build. Susanna had worn a dress that combined elegant silk Abigail had brought from Boston with lace that had belonged to Rebecca, creating something new that honored both past and future. Caleb, now 24, had assumed complete administration of a ranch section, demonstrating business talent that had multiplied family prosperity. His poems had found their way to distant city newspapers, though he maintained this activity as private pleasure rather than public ambition. He had begun courting Margaret Sullivan, the bank owner's daughter, a young woman whose practical intelligence perfectly complemented his dreamy nature. Moses, at 22, had developed his passion for medicinal plants until becoming the region's unofficial healer. His knowledge of herbs rivaled any doctor's, and he had established correspondence with Eastern universities that valued his research on native Montana plants' healing properties. He remained single, completely dedicated to his vocation and caring for the extended family that had grown around the ranch. Ruth, 19, had surprised everyone by announcing her intention to study astronomy at an Eastern university. Her correspondence with Boston academics had resulted in a scholarship that would allow her to pursue her dreams without financial burden to the family. She would leave in autumn, carrying with her the blessings of parents who had learned that true love sometimes means allowing loved ones to fly far to reach their destiny. And Daniel, now 16, had grown into a young version of his father, tall, strong, with the same quiet determination and same capacity for hard work that had characterized Ezra. But he had also inherited something of Abigail's sensitivity, an intuitive understanding of emotions that made him the natural confidant of his younger sisters. Ezra emerged from the barn as evening shadows began to stretch their purple fingers across the landscape. At 48, he had developed the distinguished stature of a man who had prospered, but without losing the rustic strength that marked him as a frontier son. His hair was completely grey now, but his blue eyes shone with the same intensity that had captivated Abigail during those first difficult days. He approached the porch with steps that spoke of satisfaction from work well done, and when he sat on the step beside Abigail's rocking chair, she automatically extended a hand to find his. It was a gesture she had repeated thousands of times over the years, but that had never lost its power to transmit love and connection. "How is our world this afternoon?" he asked, using the phrase he had developed to refer to the vast enterprise of love and work that was their family. "Perfect," Abigail replied, and for the first time in years the word carried no reservations or qualifications. Completely perfect. They looked together at the landscape stretching before them, fields where spring wheat was beginning to show, its first green shoots, mountains rising like eternal guardians on the horizon, sky tinted with colors that seemed painted specifically for their contemplation. "Do you ever regret it?" Ezra asked, repeating the question he had asked years ago, but with completely different inflection. He no longer sought reassurance, but expressed an admiration that had grown with time. Abigail smiled the same smile that had won 5 hostile children's hearts and had healed a man broken by pain. "I only regret not being braver sooner." Doubting even for a moment that love could be built brick by brick, day by day, act of kindness after act of kindness. Grace ran to the porch, her cheeks reddened by exercise and eyes shining with childhood's pure joy. She threw herself into Abigail's arms with the confidence of one who had never known rejection, and when she settled in her mother's lap, Faith woke from her nap with a soft sigh that was like music. As Ezra took the baby in his arms and Grace nestled against Abigail, the family, united in one of those moments of perfect silence that transcend words. Daniel approached from the corrals. Moses appeared in the house doorway, drying his hands on a kitchen towel, and in the distance, Caleb and Susanna's voices, who had come for dinner with her husband, approached in animated conversation. The circle was complete, but not closed. Like all true circles, this one had infinite capacity to expand to include new lives and new loves without losing its fundamental integrity. When stars began to appear in Montana's purple sky, the family gathered around the dining room table for the Sunday dinner that had become sacred tradition. The table, which had once been the scene of uncomfortable silences and unexpressed tensions, now echoed with the sound of voices interweaving in multiple conversations, plans for the next Harvest Town news, speculations about Ruth's university future. Stories the older ones shared for the younger ones' delight. Thomas Mitchell. Susanna's husband had brought news from the outside world, rumors of a distant war in a place called Cuba, marvelous inventions like automobiles that worked without horses and changes coming to eastern cities, with a speed that dizzied those who had built their lives on agriculture's eternal rhythms. "The world is changing very fast," he commented, cutting the roast beef Abigail had prepared with the recipe she had perfected during years of experimentation. Sometimes I wonder if Montana can remain as it is, or if it too will be swallowed by this modern rush. Ezra exchanged a look with Abigail before responding one of those silent communications they had developed over the years. Montana will change as everything changes, he said with the wisdom of one who had seen wild territory transform into prosperous communities. But the values that matter, the things that really make life worthwhile, those remain. Family love, honest work hospitality to strangers, respect for the land that sustains us. Those aren't passing fashions. Grace looked up from her plate with the seriousness only children can grant to profound declarations. Will we change too, Papa? Of course, little one. Ezra smiled with tenderness he had learned from Abigail. You'll grow up and become even smarter and more beautiful. Some of us will have more wrinkles and grey hair. New babies will come to the family, and some of us will leave for new adventures. But this home, this love we built together, that will remain forever. Faith from her high chair clapped with her small hands, as if she perfectly understood the promise her father had just made, provoking a round of laughter that filled the house with the world's most beautiful sound. After dinner, while dishes were washed in a familiar choreography, where each person knew their role, Abigail found herself observing her family with a perspective that only comes with time's passage and accumulation of precious memories. Moses dried plates with the same meticulousness he applied to everything in his life, while sharing with Ruth his latest observations about a plant's healing properties he had discovered near the creek. Daniel helped Grace reach high plates with patience that reminded of Ezra in his best moments. Caleb discussed expansion plans with his father and brother-in-law, his eyes shining with visions of a prosperous future. And Susanna, with faith in her arms, sang a lullaby she had learned from Abigail, who in turn had learned it from her own mother in Boston so many years ago. It was a chain of love, stretching backward through generations and projecting forward toward futures not yet imagined. Later, when visitors had left and children were in bed, Abigail and Ezra walked together toward the small family cemetery they had established on a hill overlooking the valley. There, under a willow they had planted in her memory, rested Rebecca Coleman, no longer as a ghost that tormented, but as a cherished memory that had given its blessing to the love that had flourished after her departure. The headstone was simple, carved in local granite, with words Susanna had chosen: Rebecca Coleman, beloved wife, devoted mother, remembered with affection. Beside her they had prepared space for themselves when their time came, decades in the future. Do you think she approves? Abigail asked, as she had several times over the years. Everything we built. Ezra put his arm around his wife's shoulders, drawing her to him while they contemplated the valley stretching under the moon's silver light. I'm certain of it. Rebecca loved our children more than her own life. Seeing how happy they are, how well they grew under your care, I think that would give her more joy than anything else. Our children, Abigail repeated, savoring the phrase that had taken so long to feel natural. Sometimes I forget I didn't give birth to 5 of them. They feel as much mine as Grace and Faith. That's because they are. Motherhood isn't in blood, Abigail. It's in vigil nights, caring for fevers, in tears dried after nightmares, in life lessons shared during daily tasks. You've been mother to those 5 children in ways that go beyond the biological. They began walking back to the house, their steps synchronized after years of walking together through life's paths. The windows glowed with warm light, promising warmth and comfort, and smoke from the chimney drew whimsical spirals against the stars. You know what surprises me most, Abigail murmured as they approached the porch. It's not that we built something beautiful from such a difficult beginning. It's that each day continues feeling like a new beginning, as if each dawn brought new possibilities to love more deeply, to be better than we were yesterday. Ezra stopped and turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting light spilling from the house windows. That's your magic, Abigail Coleman. You always saw possibilities where others see limitations, potential where others see problems. You took a broken family and made it stronger in the places where it broke. When they entered the house, Abigail made a final round to check that everyone was safe and comfortable. Grace slept with an arm around her favorite doll. Faith sucked her thumb with an expression of angelic satisfaction. Daniel had left a book open on his chest and snored softly. Moses had turned off his room lamp, but moonlight revealed his peaceful features. Caleb had papers scattered on his desk, where he had been working on business calculations, and Susanna's room, though empty that night, retained the scent of flowers she always kept fresh on her nightstand. In the master bedroom, while preparing for bed, Abigail looked at herself in the mirror that had belonged to Rebecca. She no longer saw the nervous and insecure woman who had arrived in Montana 10 years ago. In her place, she saw someone who had been forged by love and hard work into a version of herself she had never imagined possible. Her hands, once soft and cared for as befitted a Boston lady, now showed marks of years of work, small scars from ranch tasks, skin slightly hardened by Montana sun, and wind lines that spoke of thousands of gestures of care for those she loved. Her face had matured into a beauty different from youth, deeper, more real, illuminated from within by the satisfaction of one who found her true purpose in life. When Ezra joined her in bed, as he had every night for recent years, their bodies met, with the familiarity of lovers who had learned to read each other like favorite books. But even in familiarity there were surprises, discoveries, small revelations that kept their love fresh as mountain water. "I love you, Abigail Coleman," he murmured against her hair, words he had said thousands of times, but that never lost their power to make her heart skip. "I love you for who you were when you arrived, for who you became, and for who you'll continue being all the days we have left." "And I love you," she replied, her fingers tracing familiar lines of his face in darkness, "for giving me the chance to create something beautiful with you, for teaching me that true love is worth waiting for, and for showing me every day that happy endings aren't just for fairy tales." As they fell asleep in each other's arms, with Montana wind whispering promises through open windows, Abigail knew with absolute certainty she had found what she had been seeking without knowing her entire life. It wasn't just a home, though. She had found the most beautiful she could imagine. It wasn't just love, though she had been blessed with more than one person could reasonably expect to receive. It was something bigger and simpler. At the same time, it was the feeling of being exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who knew her completely and loved her without reservation, in a place where each day was both an adventure and a refuge. The circle was complete, and it was perfect in its imperfection, eternal in its moment, infinite in its simplicity. Somewhere in Montana territory, under stars that shone with the same intensity they had when the first settlers arrived at those lands, a family slept in peace, united by threads of love stronger than any storm, more lasting than any hardship, more valuable than any treasure the earth could offer. And in the dreams of a woman who had traveled from Boston to find her destiny on the American frontier, possibilities stretched like infinite prairies, promising tomorrows as full of love as all. The yesterdays they had built together brick by brick, moment by moment, act of kindness after act of kindness. Love had triumphed as it always triumphs when nurtured with patience, protected with courage, and shared with generosity. And this story, like all true love stories, had no end, but continued writing itself each day in the hearts of those who had learned that happiness isn't a destination, but a path traveled hand in hand.